This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open the doors of America's forgotten hospitals, where medicine met madness and silence became policy. In the early years of the 20th century, the promise of science was unshakable. Cities grew faster than faith, and the world began to believe that every human flaw, every sorrow, every madness could be studied, measured, and cured. Across the United States, new buildings rose in fields and forests. They called them state hospitals. To the newspapers, they were temples of progress. To the families who sent their loved ones through their gates, they were hope with brick walls. Byberry, in the northeast corner of Philadelphia, began that way. A place for care. A place where the lost might be guided gently back to reason. Its first patients arrived in 1907, a handful of men and women judged unfit for the world's pace. They came by carriage and were met with clean sheets, gardens, and orderlies who spoke softly. The city officials smiled at the dedication ceremony and declared that Philadelphia had given the broken a home. But time, like all things in Byberry, would rot from within. As the years passed, the beds filled. Then the corridors. Then the basements. The Great Depression emptied wallets, but filled wards. By 1936, the institution built to hold 2,000 now held 5. Patients slept side by side on floors slick with disinfectant. The doctors were few, the attendants fewer, and the word care had lost its shape. Newspapers stopped visiting. No one wanted to see the city's conscience stacked in rags. The state sent budgets, then forgot them. And within those walls, a new language of cruelty began to form, quiet, methodical, bureaucratic. The line between patient and prisoner blurred. Those who wandered too close to the city's edge, the poor, the odd, the drunk, the inconvenient, were brought there for observation. Few left. Byberry had become its own world, ruled by neglect. Inside, the days repeated: medication, labor, silence. In the men's ward, those deemed violent were chained by the ankle to metal rings bolted into the concrete. The women's ward was colder still, its windows painted shut to stop escape. The attendants, overworked and underpaid, learned indifference as a defense. And through it all, the records remained meticulous. Every cruelty written in tidy cursive, signed and dated. Then came the war, and with it, another tide of broken minds. Soldiers returned from Europe carrying invisible wounds. They called it shell shock then, later combat fatigue. To the state, it was all the same. Byberry expanded again, swallowing the new arrivals whole. In 1946, a man named Charlie Lord, a Quaker and a photographer for the Red Cross, entered the hospital with a small camera hidden under his coat. He had heard whispers, stories of filth, of neglect, of people forgotten by the very city that claimed to heal them. He expected hardship. He did not expect what he found. The photographs he took that day would not surface for months, but when they did, the nation could no longer look away. Naked bodies huddled together for warmth. Men standing motionless in their own waste. Women staring blankly at walls where the paint had long since peeled away. One attendant, smiling faintly, leaned against a door frame behind him, a cell no larger than a pantry. The pictures were evidence, but they were also prophecy. They showed not only the rot of one hospital, but the decay of an entire belief, the idea that isolation could heal what the world refused to understand. The public outcry came swiftly, Editorials demanded reform. Politicians vowed investigation. Committees met. Reports were written. And still the patients slept on the floor. Because cruelty, once institutionalized, is harder to cure than madness itself. By the 1950s, the promise of the asylum had collapsed into the architecture of despair. The hallways that once echoed with hymns of recovery now carried only the hum of fluorescent lights and the scrape of mop buckets. To enter Byberry was to step into the nation's shadow, the part of the mind it refused to face. But Byberry was not alone. Across the country, other hospitals, Pennhurst, Willowbrook, Danvers, Waverly Hills, stood like monuments to the same lie. Each one built with good intentions, each one collapsing under the same disease, neglect disguised as order. The state kept the doors locked. The world moved on. And behind the walls, the quiet continued. By the middle of the 20th century, America had built an empire of walls. Each state maintained its own system of hospitals and institutions meant to treat those whom society could not understand. But those walls, high and thick and far from the city center, were built for more than treatment. They were built for forgetting. Pennhurst in rural Pennsylvania was the sister to Byberry, larger, more ambitious, and equally doomed. Its buildings stretched across 100 acres of woods and riverbank, their red brick facades noble in the sunlight, their interiors already crumbling. The first patients had been children, sent there not because they were sick, but because they were inconvenient. Orphans, the disabled, the abandoned. Those whom the census could not categorize found their way to Pennhurst. Inside, they were numbered. Their names were recorded once and then erased by routine. The staff called them inmates. Work was mandatory. Punishment was creative. And when food ran short, so did mercy. By 1955, nearly 5,000 people lived inside Pennhurst's 1,400 rooms. There were only a handful of doctors and fewer nurses. The rest of the staff were attendants, men paid almost nothing to manage the unwanted. They learned cruelty not from hatred but from fatigue. It was easier to strike than to soothe. Easier to shout than to explain. Easier to forget than to remember that those before you were human. Visitors, when they were allowed, described the same smell everywhere: bleach, urine, and despair. The air felt thick, like something that clung to you after you left. In the children's ward, the small ones sat in rows, rocking themselves. They were not spoken to. They were not held. And when one died, the bed was stripped and another body placed upon it. The machine did not stop. Pennhurst was not alone. Across the country, similar places bloomed like rot beneath the skin. In New York, Willowbrook State School promised care for children with developmental disabilities. By the time the press finally entered, the conditions were beyond language. Thousands of naked bodies huddled together in rooms designed for a fraction of that number. Filth covered the floors. Rats competed with children for scraps of food. And yet the doors remained locked. It took decades before a journalist named Geraldo Rivera carried a camera into Willowbrook and showed the world what progress had hidden. The footage was broadcast in 1972. For the first time, Americans saw the truth their institutions had been built to conceal. The nation gasped and then looked away again. Reform was promised, inquiries were held, reports written. But cruelty has a way of surviving bureaucracy. The buildings stayed full, the lights stayed on, and the silence continued. Even in the years that followed, when the language of care changed, the systems remained the same. Electric shocks replaced straitjackets, lobotomies replaced chains. The architecture of compassion was built from the same stone as control. In the laboratories of the 1950s and 60s, the pursuit of science crept further into the mind. There were experiments now not in curing illness, but in rewriting the brain itself. Some of these were public, many were not. Under the dull hum of fluorescent lights in hospitals across America, patients were given injections without consent, hypnotized, deprived of sleep, and submerged in sensory isolation. They called it treatment. In truth, it was research. And behind it all was a single name that history would learn too late. MK-Ultra, the government's quiet marriage between medicine and control. The program reached into asylums, universities, prisons, and hospitals. The same walls that once held the forgotten now held the unwitting. LSD trials, hypnosis, electroconvulsive tests. Human minds treated as soil for a crop of obedience. In Montreal, a man named Dr. Ewan Cameron believed he could erase madness by erasing memory itself. He worked at the Allen Memorial Institute, a place that promised healing but practiced silence. His patients came for help. They left with minds wiped clean or shattered. The CIA funded his work through front organizations, never once stepping through the door to see the cost. When the truth emerged decades later, it was already history. The victims were old, the doctors retired, the money long spent. Apologies came on embossed stationery, signed in ink that would never smudge. And still, nothing changed. Because the walls remained. Because the idea remained that if you locked away what frightened you, it would cease to exist. The mid-century hospitals were full of ghosts that still breathed. Byberry, Pennhurst, Willowbrook, Willowbrook names whispered like curses. Each building carried the same blueprint: isolation, decay, denial. What began as architecture for healing became architecture for silence. And through that silence, the country learned a terrible lesson: that it is possible to build entire cities dedicated to forgetting and call them hospitals. By the late 1960s, the illusion could no longer hold. The grand facades of America's hospitals, those red brick palaces of order, had begun to crumble from within. Inside their walls, cruelty had become routine. Outside, the world was changing. A new generation had come of age, one that questioned everything. They saw photographs of war and wondered if the same violence lived at home. They heard rumors of electric shocks, of forgotten wards, of voices crying behind bolted doors, and they began to listen. For the first time in half a century, people started asking what had happened to the souls their nation had hidden away. The answers came slowly, reluctantly, through leaks and whispers. Doctors who could no longer bear the smell of neglect carried their guilt into the open. Reporters followed, lawyers soon after. And when they spoke, the world finally learned what the walls had kept for generations. The first major crack came in 1975 with a case called O'Connor v. Donaldson. It began with one man, Kenneth Donaldson, who had been locked inside a Florida asylum for 15 years. He was not violent. He was not dangerous. He had simply been inconvenient. A jury of ordinary citizens looked at the evidence, his petitions ignored, his sanity documented and dismissed, and declared what should have been obvious all along. You cannot imprison a man for being different. That verdict echoed across the country like the fall of a stone tower. Every institution heard it, though not all listened. The courts ruled that mental illness alone was not enough to justify captivity. The hospitals were ordered to release thousands. And suddenly, America's hidden cities began to empty. It should have been a victory. It should have been salvation. But freedom, when it comes too late, can be its own kind of cruelty. The patients who stepped into the sunlight did not recognize the world that awaited them. They had no families left, no homes, no education. Many could barely speak after years of silence. The streets of the 1970s filled with those who had once filled the wards. And America, having torn down its asylums, built no refuge to replace them. In Philadelphia, Byberry closed its gates in 1987. Reporters who entered for the final inspection described scenes that seemed frozen in time. Mattresses torn open, personal effects scattered, entire rooms abandoned mid-meal as though the occupants had simply evaporated. The air was heavy with ammonia and dust. Photographs of families still hung on cracked plaster walls. The floors were littered with patient records, names and dates fluttering like leaves. Pennhurst shut down a few years earlier in 1986 after a long and bitter lawsuit. Former patients stood in court and described their years inside. Their voices were calm, matter-of-fact. That calmness frightened the jury more than any outburst could. One man described being tied to a bench for so long that his legs forgot how to walk. Another woman said she learned to speak by mimicking the sounds of rats in the walls. When she smiled in court, it was not joy. It was proof that she remembered what smiling was supposed to look like. The verdict declared Pennhurst unconstitutional. It was not just a hospital. It was a violation of humanity itself. When the gates were locked for the last time, the press gathered for photographs. They expected triumph. What they captured was silence. Reporters stood before the empty brick buildings, uncertain what to say. Behind them, the hills were covered with frost. The air was still. The echoes of half a century of suffering seemed to cling to the trees. By then, Willowbrook too was gone, dismantled piece by piece under public pressure. The state of New York promised to create smaller, humane centers of care. But the money was thin, the public's patience thinner, and the old pattern repeated, neglect disguised as progress. For every patient freed, another was lost to the streets. The nation congratulated itself for compassion and then turned away again. In downtowns and underpasses, those who once belonged to the hospitals built new walls, cardboard, plastic, and silence. They talked to themselves in the same rhythms they had once used to answer nurses. And the world called them crazy. The asylums were gone, but their ghosts had only changed addresses. There were moments of light, brief and fragile. Activists, many of them former patients, began to speak publicly. They called themselves survivors, not patients, and demanded recognition. Their testimony turned the word mental illness into something that could be spoken without shame. Some even returned to the ruins of the hospitals that had once held them, walking through the corridors like archaeologists of their own pain. One man, standing inside his former cell at Pennhurst, ran his fingers along the rusted iron ring still embedded in the wall and whispered, "This was my world." He smiled. He was free, but the ring did not move. In the decades that followed, the empty buildings became a new kind of monument. Urban explorers, photographers, and ghost hunters crept through the ruins. They called them haunted, and perhaps they were. But the haunting was not supernatural. It was historical. The ghosts were memory itself, the collective guilt of a nation that had learned to hide its own suffering behind locked doors. Some of those photographs still circulate online. Long corridors collapsing under their own dust, wheelchairs abandoned in moonlight, paint curling from the walls like old skin. Each image feels alive. Each is a reminder that once we built palaces for pain and called them progress. The ruins of America's state hospitals still stand, broken monuments scattered across the countryside. They loom over highways and river valleys, their towers reaching through fog like fingers searching for forgiveness. By day they are silent, their windows punched out, their halls open to wind and ivy. By night, they glow in the imagination of anyone who passes. The last breath of a patient, the echo of boots along tile, a door that never learned to stay closed. History calls them abandoned. But that isn't true. You can abandon a building. You cannot abandon memory. When the walls of Byberry came down, local children began sneaking inside. They found files scattered across the floor, records of lives reduced to shorthand, aggressive, unresponsive, needs supervision. Each line a summary of a lifetime. Each signature a kind of burial. Some of the names still had addresses once upon a time. But the houses were long gone. No one came to claim them. In the years that followed, the ruins became a new kind of attraction. Photographers wandered through the corridors with flashlights and tripods, capturing the beauty of decay. They called it urbex, urban exploration. To them, these hospitals were not crimes, they were canvases. Each collapsed ceiling, each broken wheelchair told a story the world had tried to erase. The images they brought back went viral in the early days of the internet. People were drawn to them not out of cruelty, but curiosity, a need to look at something society had hidden for so long. And in those photographs, America saw itself again. The optimism, the arrogance, the belief that you could lock away what frightened you and call it compassion. The ruins became symbols. They appeared in horror films and music videos, in stories whispered on message boards late at night. Every hallway was said to be haunted. Every photograph captured faces that were not there. But the real haunting was quieter. It lived in the knowledge that every ghost story was rooted in a truth worse than fiction. In some of these places, the past still breathes through the paint. Pennhurst remains partly preserved, its wards turned into a museum of sorts. Visitors walk where patients once slept and listen to recordings of testimony gathered from survivors. Some weep. Some take pictures. Most leave in silence. There are no jump scares in Pennhurst, no staged apparitions, just the realization that the cruelty was ordinary, methodical, bureaucratic. Willowbrook is gone now, replaced by new schools and apartment complexes. Children play soccer where thousands once suffered. The earth has swallowed the concrete, but not the weight of what it held. And in Montreal, the building where Dr. Ewan Cameron erased minds still stands as part of McGill University. Students walk its halls every day, unaware that beneath their feet lies the echo of human experiments once hidden by government seal. These places are not haunted because of spirits. They are haunted because they remember what we choose to forget. In time, the field of mental health transformed. Medications replaced confinement. Therapy replaced isolation. But the same old questions linger. What do we owe the vulnerable? How much control can compassion justify? And how many mistakes can a society call treatment before it begins to sound like cruelty by another name? Modern hospitals are cleaner now, smaller, efficient. Yet the ghost of the asylum lives on in every locked ward, every underfunded shelter, every person talking to themselves under a bridge. The architecture changed, the idea did not. We learned to speak more gently about the mind, but the silence remains. And sometimes when the news speaks of a tragedy, a man untreated, a woman lost to delusion, people ask why help never came. But help, like memory, is a fragile thing. It cannot reach where society refuses to look. A handful of the survivors lived long enough to tell their stories in their own words. They spoke softly, without bitterness. One woman, interviewed in her 70s, said, "They took my youth, but they did not take my mind. That was the mistake they made." She lived alone, by choice, in a small apartment filled with books. On her kitchen wall hung a single photograph, an image of the building she had once called home. When asked why she kept it, she said quietly, "Because forgetting is how it happens again." And perhaps that is the truest ghost story of all. Not the whispers in abandoned wards, not the shadows on the walls, but the slow collective forgetting that lets cruelty return wearing new clothes. The state hospitals are gone now, but their ruins are seeds. From them grew new fields of understanding, new conversations about dignity, autonomy, and care. Yet every generation must learn the same lesson again. That progress without compassion is just another cage built from cleaner stone. So if you ever find yourself standing before the skeleton of a hospital, if you feel the wind move through a broken window and hear the soft rhythm of dripping water, listen closely. That sound is not the dead. It is memory itself, slowly reminding the living what they promised never to repeat. This was Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we walked the long corridors of America's forgotten hospitals, where medicine met madness, where silence became policy, and where history still waits quietly for someone to remember.